Today we are going to begin lecture number 4 of an ongoing course series on the study of open versus closed systems, which involves both an admixture of philosophy, science, economic considerations, and even the arts. As promised, my pace for those who are used to hearing me speak, you will notice, will be substantially slower in tempo than usual since this broadcast is intended to be translated into various languages, and so I do not wish to cause a headache unnecessarily to my poor translators. So I'm going to, as usual, share some slides as we go through a new chapter, another aspect of our voyage of discovery. And this one will begin to take on, for the first time, some concrete facts that pertained directly to the discoveries that I had made within the course of my Clash of the Two Americas and Untold History of Canada, with the first being a focus on the origins of the deep state in North America and a lot more. So without further ado, here is the PowerPoint. So this lecture I've chosen to title On the Study of Universal History. What we will be seeing today specifically will be some words on the study of universal history as a field of science, one that has been highly overlooked and I would say to a certain degree, even outright sabotaged. And the other section, the thrust of our presentation, will be devoted to the specific question of how and why Canada became a wedge between US-Russia cooperation. So the first question to hold in mind here is, what is history? We know that there are many opinions about history, but one question that I would ask is it the study of the past, or is it the study of the future? That may seem absurd, since people might obviously say, yes, it's certainly the study of the past. The future hasn't happened yet. So how could we possibly treat history as something which hasn't happened yet? I would here encourage people to think back and maybe revisit some of the remarks of Lecture 2 pertaining to Plato's concepts of a discovery as recollection, and what we evaluated as Plato's concept of a remembrance vectored towards the future as the basis of his proof that all human beings are made in the image of a living, reasonable creator, and that the soul, which must exist according to this proof that Plato constructs, is contingent upon our ability to make discoveries of universals, knowing that there is something universal within us that must recognize that which has a universal characteristic, a divine characteristic, outside of us. So that will be useful in contemplating this broader but very connected question itself of history. Let us contrast this with some important popular definitions as presented by the Encyclopedia Britannica. I have selected these principal five definitions of history that showed up on the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I think most people, if you were to ask them, would agree on one or more of these particularly popular, socially accepted, professionally accepted definitions of the study of history. Number one, Encyclopedia Britannica notes that it could be considered the study of past events. Number two, events of the past, which in my mind is just another way of saying the same thing. Number three, past events that relate to a particular subject, place, organization, etc. Number four, a written record of important events that have happened since the beginning of something. Or number five, an established record of past events, actions, etc. Now I'd like to look at something a little bit more interesting. A character who has shown up in lecture number 1 and lecture number 2, who plays a very important role in my own cognitive intellectual development and many of the discoveries that I have made over the course of my career, is a figure who we will meet once again here, named Lyndon LaRouche, an American philosopher and a physical economist, and somebody who had written an essay available online called History as Science on February 8th of 1993. where he writes and discusses the possibility and the need to reverse the trend of stupidification in the general Western population, which has continued um, in an unmitigated fashion over the course of several generations prior to his having written this. And how could this reversal begin? How must this restoration of human thought, human wisdom, to something that is survivable, that is based upon the considerations of natural law, how can this be even possible at this late stage of rot? And he writes, what are the means for bringing about such an early and rapid reversal of decades old trends in public opinion? That question, posed in these terms, could point us to a subject matter best described as the science of history. Pagan Rome rotted into moral self-extinction when the fans of the sports arena became the political parties of government, just as the sterile fanaticism of televised mass spectator sports rots out the political morality of U.S. public opinion today. Such specific culturally determining factors are among the leading topics of today's urgently needed applied science of history. Unfortunately, the study of a recognizable subject called history is virtually outlawed by the politically correct classroom of today. In those earlier decades, the 1960s and earlier, when the business of respectable schools and universities still was education, the subject of history was introduced by calling the student's attention to the point that we must understand the distinction between a mere chronicle of events and the taught subject which we named history. In those past decades, in European civilization's classical educational programs, we would be readily understood if we had said that the practice of writing history as distinct from merely storytelling or chronicles begins with the application of the conceptions of composition of classical Greek tragedy, the study of causes for induced survival or collapse of entire governments, states, or even entire cultures. In such professional circles of earlier times, it would have been regarded as admissible to draw up a sort of list of selected great tragedians, such as the following ones: Aeschylus, Marlowe, Cervantes, Shakespeare, and Friedrich Schiller. None of them would contest the outstanding relevance. None of them, would contest the outstanding relevance of Schiller for such a list. First, as to tragedy itself, Schiller was the only composer to render intelligible principles employed by all great classical tragedians. Second, in his capacity as Jena University professor of universal history and otherwise, he was the first to render intelligible the unique connection between the methods of historiography and of composition of classical tragedy. In the present location, Schiller's notion of universal history is adopted implicitly. And this is the method that I have also taken to my heart. I encourage everyone to read Schiller's lectures on the science of universal history, both his lecture on the legislations of Lycurgus's Sparta versus Solon's Athens, his mission of Moses, his Jesuit government in Paraguay, and especially his What is and to what end do we study universal history, in conjunction with Schiller's work, as LaRouche proposes, of his great tragedies, especially things like Don Carlos, for one. So without further ado, let's continue on to the more potent definitions of history. We've seen 5 impotent definitions as promoted by Encyclopedia Britannica. Let's look at 5 more potent definitions now. One of them that I've listed here could be considered history as the art of paradox resolution. Number 2, the investigation of futures. Number 3, the study of tragedy. Number 4, the study of open versus closed systems. And I would add here a fifth, which redefines the present as future history. So to subjectively see our present circumstances from the lens of those yet unborn historians who are going to be looking down upon our current age and wonder, what did they do wrong? What did I personally do that was either necessary to avoid a tragedy, to play my role, my part in doing everything possible to ensure that my society did not embrace tragedy and folly and collapse, or what I did to advance it and to participate in said tragedy, perhaps. If I myself am incapable of breaking with my own internal tragic and stupid impulses. So the subjective, willful factor is, I think, a very important concept, which is introduced by reshifting our idea of what the present is into the standpoint of a broader field. And indeed, we are living in history. Similarly, I would say that looking at the past as futures that did or did not come into being based upon intentions, designs, ideas that were fought for is another important concept. In that sense, history is not simply a timeline on which we can place events, as is so popularly promoted. Let's look at an example here of a living history, a moment that we're currently experiencing. Some of this that we are seeing of the Chinese Polar Silk Road extension to the broader Belt and Road Initiative is has already been done. Much of it is being built as we speak. It may not come into blossom the way that this beautiful graph illustrates. It may be sabotaged. It's possible. But without the idea of the future governing the unfolding of each of the moments of the present, then it is impossible really to carry out any type of successful fight for the survival of the species. We know that ill-intended individuals with power have conspired throughout history. Well, I would also say good-intended individuals moving in alignment with ideas of natural law that are tied to the true interests of our species also shape concrete ideas and visions for the future and work to bring them about. In that sense, attention, almost as a physical principle of tension, can be recognized, built into the fabric of human history, premised upon the incompatibility of governing sets of ideas of what humanity is, what we should be, what we should do. So again, the manifestation of a world of cooperation based upon a transcendence out of the closed system Hobbesian doctrine of zero-sum games is a beautiful prospect, and one which we know certain members of society that are wielding power, especially amongst the multipolar alliance, are moving towards. We know that this is not a new idea per se, and that even over a decade ago, this is from 2011, Vladimir Putin had made an offer for the West to join in with Russia and other Eurasian nations in constructing the Belt and Road Initiative as part of a multi-generational policy to redefine the Arctic as a domain of mutual cooperation. Unfortunately, he was rejected in those offers, but it remained on the table. In 2020, September 26th, 2020, we know that President Donald Trump, in his first term in office, at the very end, did endorse, passed an executive order endorsing the construction of the Alaska to Alberta Railway that would have, for the first time in history, connected Alaska down to both Canada as well as the other 48 states in the lower part of the continent by railroads. This is a project long overdue, and when we look at the website of the consortium that put together this A2A company with its broad vision and engineering feasibility studies, we could see clearly that the only way that this was justified financially was through a look towards China and the broader growth market, the broader market being developed by the Belt and Road Initiative of Asia and the East more broadly. This would have brought us much more closer into a prospect of finally here in Canada and the broader North American continent in opening up the Arctic for real long-term development which has been withheld for a very long time. President Trump had also messaged out to his base after passing the executive order, writing, based on the strong recommendation of Senator Dan Sullivan and Representative Don Young of the great state of Alaska, it is my honor to inform you that I will be issuing a presidential permit for the A2A cross-border rail between Alaska and Canada. Congratulations to the people of Alaska and Canada. And this, I believe, would have brought the world much more close into an orientation of joining up through the already robust and continuously building Belt and Road, the Eurasian development corridors, the Belt and Road, as well as the Polar Silk Road, Putin's Far East development strategy, and the need to restore a pro-industrial long-term orientation in the collapsing West, premised around rail, building new cities, building new industrial corridors, applying new discoveries, and really focusing it with high-speed rail. The Bering Strait, as we could see there, is only 55 miles separating Russia from the United States. So this is an idea of the future. On the one hand, a future that is underdefined and that may be sabotaged. We don't know exactly. President Trump will be coming in for a second term, and we don't know if that spirit will be restored or if worse ideas that pertain to something more imperial will be implemented. We don't know. But the point is, there is a fight. Now, this idea of a potential future is one idea, but are we really looking at the future or are we looking at the past? Why do I say that? Because the first time that this was presented as a map to the world was actually in the form of this 1890 international rail map that was called Gilpin's American Economic, Just, and Correct Map of the World, published for the first time in the Cosmopolitan Railway, written by William Gilpin, the first governor of Colorado. And what we see is a picture of railways that would be extended through the Bering Strait, that would connect the Trans-Siberian with the Transcontinental of the United States, down through the Darien Gap in Mexico before that, and into the broader South America, all across. We see rails all across from down to Vladivostok and China, India, throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. So this is an idea that has been a vision of the future that is long overdue. And we're going to see in the course of this presentation and future lectures why this didn't happen yet, why this future almost came into being in some ways, but was always prevented, and how and why it was prevented and by whom. I mentioned William Gilpin. He was, as I said, the governor of Colorado. That is him on the right facing Abraham Lincoln. He was one of the 11-man elite bodyguard that Lincoln had requested that accompanied him as he moved from Illinois to Washington, D.C. after his election. He was known far and wide as the prophet of manifest destiny, and he was a Civil War hero who prevented the opening up of the West at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in 1862. He also was a follower of the national system of Hamilton, which we discussed briefly, and we're going to discuss even more in future lectures, as the American system of political economy, the utilization thus of national banking protectionism, and the idea of wiring the behavior of money and credit towards internal improvements that boost both the national productive powers of society as a whole, as well as uplift each individual to a better way. And he was somebody who organized voraciously after the Civil War internationally for the growth of the rail that had opened up the West to extend all the way around the world, as he illustrated in his book. Abraham Lincoln, it is little known but very important, had asserted in 1864, a few months before he was to be murdered, in a speech to the U.S. Congress, saying, "The proposed overland telegraph between America and Europe, by way of Bering Straits and Asiatic Russia, which was sanctioned by Congress at the last session, has been undertaken under very favorable circumstances. Assurances have been received from the most of the South American states of their high appreciation of the enterprise and their readiness to cooperate in constructing lines tributary to that world-encircling communication. Lincoln was here referring directly to the growth of telegraph lines, railroads that would intersect the world in a new idea of cooperation instead of might makes right. Lincoln, we know also in the midst of the Civil War, as Russia had intervened to save the Americans from a precarious situation by bringing the naval fleets of Russia to the coasts of the United States in both the Pacific and the Atlantic, had been able to turn the tide, but also initiated the construction of the world's first transcontinental railway that would connect one ocean to another in an entire continent, as we see there on the map. It was begun in the middle of the Civil War in 1863, and it would be finished by 1869. The intention was always to extend this northward through British Columbia and upwards thence into Alaska and the broader Russian territories. We could see also through such admirers of Lincoln who had collaborated with Lincoln's allies amongst the Republican anti-slavery networks that the building of the Trans-Siberian would in so many ways be modeled on the success and similar terrain in many ways of that faced by the Americans. Those are just a few pictures of some core individuals of the story, though there were many more, featuring such men as Dmitry Mendeleev, who chaired the Committee for the Protective Tariff of Russia, opposing British free trade in his speeches, which I have published in my own books. We have there Finance Minister Ivan Vishnegradsky, another admirer of Lincoln's techniques and policies, which were applied to begin an industrialization of Russia after the freeing of the serfs, which was done by Tsar Alexander II, who, even before Lincoln posted the Emancipation Proclamation, had freed the serfs in a very bold maneuver against the feudal class of elites of Russia that had many of whom had preferred to keep control of their feudal system and prevent industrial development or technological progress. The other man on the upper left-hand side is Sergei Witte, who was the transport minister in 1890, as well as the finance minister and soon prime minister, who was a strategist who had overseen the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway as part of a much grander design, which very few people I've noticed properly have come to understand. The Trans-Siberian was even built with the help and assistance of many American engineers with rail cars that were built in Philadelphia at the Baldwin locomotives that were the first to run across Russia from east to west. And always the intention was to extend it through the Bering Strait. And keep in mind, the sale of Alaska in 1867 was affected by those who were also great supporters of extending this program of development through that Bering Strait, including Edouard de Stockel, the Russian ambassador, and William Seward, the American Secretary of State, who continued on Lincoln's vision for years after Lincoln died. But it didn't happen. So the question is, why did this future not happen over a century ago? What occurred? What got in the way? And to answer that question forces one to look at the role of a particular nation which I happen to be sitting in at this very moment, called Canada. And there we have Canada, the second largest landmass of a nation on the globe, right there on a map, separating Alaska from the United States. But it didn't always look like that. But let's look at Canada from some other eyes. Here's another way of looking at Canada that I think is indicative and showcases quite a bit what has been the consequence of living under an empire devoted to preventing real cultural or economic development. And what you see there is a graph featuring the population density across Canada, and what we see is the upper part of the United States as well. Canada itself has approximately 4.2 people per square kilometer which is one of the lowest population densities of any nation on the Earth. One peculiar attribute of this map is that we could find that about 90% of the Canadian population lives on a very thin stretch, approximately 200 miles from the border of the United States. The vast majority of Canada is almost entirely uninhabited, untouched by human action or thought. Another way of looking at Canada can be looking at a British Empire map, this one being from 1921, as Britain as an empire extended across approximately 24% of the Earth's surface and had maritime dominance still of the shipping lanes around the world. That is how this small island was able to be a one world government of sorts, by keeping as many nations of the world as underdeveloped and dependent upon exports and imports from shipping, which means no one was permitted under British Empire strategy to develop their internal powers as continental powers. That had to be fought for every step of the way, which will again be the thrust of much of what I will be going through today and in future presentations. Now, someone might say, but that is the British Empire. It no longer exists. Well, I would say maybe in the form of the name British Empire. However, today, where there is still what is known as the British Commonwealth of Nations, which all feature a monarchy as the head apex and an ability to manage and coordinate to a certain degree shadow government institutions from behind the scenes, that manage much of the strategic resources. $1 trillion globally annually of resources from Africa are traded across the London Stock Exchange, and major companies in Australia, Canada, and London that also tend to have branches within the Cayman Islands. Money laundering centers also contained there, but many of these companies are also very active in controlling the strategic resources of places like Africa. And one could say, when you look at my book series, even the character of that deep state which has transformed the United States into a vicious empire has less of an American pedigree and much more of a British Rhodes Scholar, Fabian Society pedigree. And so I would almost, if it were up to me, paint America, the United States, as a light blue, perhaps. However, uh, the map, when you compare the previous British Empire and the current Commonwealth of Nations, there isn't that much difference. Another way of thinking about Canada is to recognize that the Canadian Constitution itself, which has a certain type of preamble, was written in 1867, just the very same year, and in fact, just a few days after the sale of Alaska to the United States was effected. Just a few days later, on July 1st, 1867, this was ratified in London, creating for the first time a sort of constitution for Canada. And the peculiar thing about our Constitution, which no Canadian that I have ever met knows by heart, whereas most Americans still know what their Constitution says in its preamble by heart, not so the case of even the most educated Canadians that I have seen. Now, within the first page of our Constitution, it says and lays out the purpose, the raison d'être for what is Canada and what will it be and what will it do. It says, whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, and whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. So here we have a national constitution which has two fallacies that I can see immediately. Number one, we it says that we will have a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. Well, legal scholars have actually inquired into what exactly is the Constitution of the United Kingdom, and in fact, there is none. There is simply an array of legal precedents upon precedents that have been built up, but there is no British Constitution whatsoever. And so we are modeling ourselves on or mimicking a non-existent shadow. So a shadow of a shadow is what the Canadian Constitution is actually admitting itself to be. The second fallacy is that unlike most nations' constitutions, which profess some purpose that is tied to the interests of the people, the nation, the general welfare of the people living who make up the nation, not so with the case of Canada, where it says clearly that our purpose is to promote the interests of the British Empire. So this is again a shadow of a battle over ideas that occurred at a pregnant moment, a drama on the stage of history at this moment at the end of the Civil War. And I would say as well, one thing, the actual drafting of this act, though it was passed into law in 1867, the writing of it, the drafting of it, was in fact written in 1864 in a conference in Canada, which was at the heart as America, the United States, was still fighting its civil war. And it was becoming clear that one British funded and organized confederacy was failing in the South, and Lincoln was successful in putting it down, that civil war, while keeping the Union together. Another anti-American confederacy was being set up and was to be more successful, which was the Northern Confederacy of the British, and that is Canada. So for the sake of contrast, keeping the open versus closed system concept in mind, let's just quickly compare what we just read to two founding US documents, which together, as Lincoln pointed out, were one legal principle, but in two documents. The first being the Declaration of Independence of 1776, and the second being the US Constitution of 1787. In the 1776 Declaration, and there we have Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson going through drafts of what would be the actual writing. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now that's a real constitution. One might say, oh, but they didn't abide by those high principles. It took many more years for the battle against the slave institution to manifest, but there was observable battles, and that's what's important. The ideals are one thing. The human fallible domain where there are self-contradictory people, very flawed people trying to act according to high ideals, but failing so often for corruption or stupidity or otherwise, is two separate ideas, but we have to see the conjunction, the connection between the two. And without the principles, then there isn't much to guide our improvement. So on the issue, thus, of improvement, I would like to add a second consideration, which is the U.S. Constitution, and in the preamble that defines how all of the other elements of the Constitution must be read and with what interpretation. The preamble is the key. And it says that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Again, the idea of a more perfect union, as I've talked about in the past, would seem to a simple Aristotelian as an absurdity because something can either be more better or it could be perfect. But to say more perfect would seem to be a logical contradiction. However, the founding fathers who authored that document, including Benjamin Franklin himself, were Platonic and not Aristotelian. Thus, they were not troubled by the problems of computer Aristotelian neurotic logic. They had a higher idea of creative reason, which does necessitate the conjunction of concepts like more and perfect together for certain very important principles. So the next question here, knowing that there was this heightened movement at a certain moment of potential within history, the question then became in my mind early on as I began my investigation was, why did Canada fail the Ben Franklin Challenge? Now, what am I talking about? What is this Ben Franklin Challenge? Well, the first thing to get us to look at and appreciate the Ben Franklin Challenge is one, you can read my book on the clash of the two Americas. Or here's another way of looking at it. One thing that caught my eye in 2006, there was a commemorative stamp issued celebrating the 250th anniversary of Canada's postal service. Now, the thing that struck out in a paradox for me as a Canadian was the figure of Benjamin Franklin. They're looking at me from the stamp. And in fact, I was surprised to dig in a little bit into this paradox, this anomaly that struck out in my mind like a splinter. Why was this American here on my Canadian stamp? Well, he was actually the founder of Canada's postal service while he was Postmaster General of the colonies in 1756. So the idea that Benjamin Franklin had when he did so, as in his own writings, was that he was trying to uplift the culture and break free of the peasant mentality of feudalism that had been dominant in France and that had been pervasive in New France, which was Canada back in those days, a territory recently gained control of by the British. And the idea of creating a postal service was to expand the perspective of the citizens living within society to not have a local, small identity, but one that recognizes higher contexts and can correspond with people far removed from our senses, and thus be able to conceptualize ideas of law, ideas of systems that transcend my local lifestyle. So that was part of his nation building, his cultural warfare, in a sense, to create the preconditions for people capable of participating in their government. Another paradox that struck me was that he was also the architect of Canada's first newspaper system, knowing once again that only illiterate and informed people will have the qualifications to make decisions, wise decisions, about their society and where it is going. And so he brought in, as we see at the figure on the right, close ally from France that he invited and who took him up on the offer to come to Quebec and set up the first Canadian newspaper. His name was Fleury Maupelat, a Republican revolutionary figure. And he began publishing the Montreal Gazette. And he also, through his presses, began publishing the letters to the inhabitants of Quebec from the Continental Congress, which we're going to see a little bit more of. But before we go into any of that, since Benjamin Franklin did so much to build core cultural institutions for Canada that were the foundation of creating any type of viable nation, he was also, we should know, up in Canada itself in 1776, personally trying to organize the Canadians to come down and join as the 14th colony, signing the Declaration of Independence together. That failed. So before we go into its failure, its sabotage, I want to just point out something about Benjamin Franklin. as a man who was both a great philosopher, a political statesman of a high order, and also poet and a scientist. And that is Benjamin Franklin there, painted by his friend Benjamin West. Benjamin West was an American painter from Philadelphia who Benjamin Franklin was able to arrange, um, let's just say, a job in England in 1771. And when he arrived, he was brought into certain networks that Franklin had organized, which made him first a member of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of England, and he soon became the greatest painter of all England, rising to become its president for nearly 15 years. And this was an American Philadelphian, an admirer of Lincoln, and somebody who, through his talent, insight, and his ability to engage in counterintelligence, rose through the ranks of the arts and culture community and became something of a celebrity. Now, Benjamin Franklin is there featured with some angels carrying out scientific experiments, some cherubs, and there he is with his famous key featuring him as a Prometheus figure, taking the fire, the electrical fire from the gods, and transforming it and giving it to the mortals, to mankind, to have greater dignity and greater understanding of ourselves and of the universe. So Benjamin Franklin's discoveries, his work on electricity, which perplexed the greatest scientists of Europe for years, and he was able to make discoveries that no other educated scientist of the greatest universities was able to accomplish, despite having something of a grade 3 education. But having great advisors, great mentors along the way, he was able to, and especially a love and character within him and a drive to make discoveries, he could do this and discover the nature positive electrical charges within the electric fluid. And with that new knowledge, gain a mastery of building all sorts of devices that utilized electricity and that revolutionized all of humankind. Now, he was a powerhouse. He, in many ways, lived his life as an example of what he believed all human beings could be. And that's another painting of Ben Franklin. And here are just some keystones of his life that I wanted to bring to the audience's attention. He himself, as an inventor, invented many things we take for granted, including bifocals, the glass harmonica. It's an instrument which Mozart was so smitten by that he even wrote songs for Franklin's glass harmonica. The rocking chair, lightning rod. He discovered the Gulf Stream in 1775, which cut off days of transit between the old and new worlds. He discovered electricity and invented terms like battery, charge, and conductor. He created the first fire department in 1736, the first public library in Philadelphia in 1731, and he founded the University of Pennsylvania. In 1725, he was deployed to England on a counterintelligence operation of the London Hellfire Club to investigate what were the upper elites of the British Empire planning and plotting for the colonies and the world more broadly. And this was documented in a book by H. Graham Lowry called How the Nation Was Won, which can be found even today online. In 1729, he set up the Pennsylvania Gazette and began printing his Poor Richard's Almanac from 1733 until 1759. This was an important almanac, a magazine, an early magazine, which was designed to uplift the minds and the morals of the American citizens to become qualified to do what they couldn't do in the 1730s or even 40s or 50s, which is understand the deeper philosophical nature of liberty, human nature, God, and why it is necessary at times to fight and risk one's life for the sake of liberty. In 1743, he offered proposals for the promotion of useful knowledge, which is, as he wrote, one society be formed on virtuosi or ingenious men residing in the several colonies to be called the American Philosophical Society, who are to remain in constant correspondence. This was a very important aspect of creating an intelligentsia that could be the guardians, the moral guardians of society that would be devoted to increasing the powers of all humankind to participate as sovereigns within the creation of a new sovereign government resistant to hereditary powers of might makes right or morality by the powerful through bloodlines. So that required really the cultivation of leaders, of teachers who were able to activate their deeper powers of mental, of creative reason. In 1748, he was elected to the Philadelphia City Council. In 1751, he was made a member of the Colonial Assembly. In 1752, he discovered electricity and was also appointed Postmaster General of the Americas, a very important strategic position to have at that time, especially. Like Leibniz, who in many ways he followed in the footsteps of the great Gottfried Leibniz, who died while he was just a small child. Um, Ben Franklin was a prolific letter writer and organizer of people around the world. There are thousands and thousands that have been survived and many more that were lost to the sands of time. In 1753, he created Canada's post office, as I mentioned, in Halifax, and extended lines to Quebec City and Montreal in 1763. In 1754, he put forth the first proposal to unite the 13 colonies in the form of a plan of union, adopted by the Albany Congress, but rejected by the other colonies, unfortunately, which would have called for creating effectively a unified front of the American colonies in the form of states and the basis of organizing harmoniously for the defense of the people living in those states against the interests of the British Empire more broadly. In 1757, he was appointed Pennsylvania ambassador to England. In 1760, he wrote the Canada pamphlets, which won control over Canada. So these were important pamphlets whereby, upon their victory over the French, the British had a choice of which parts of French Americas they would be able to control. Many wanted the money-making regions of the Caribbean that the French had control over because you could make more money more efficiently through the sugar and rum production systems there. Whereas Benjamin Franklin recognized, although at this time you couldn't make more money off of the control of French Canada, the potential for the development of a society was so much higher. And so he made the very persuasive case, which won over enough audience members within Britain that decided to select Canada instead of the Caribbean regions. In 1775, he was elected to the Continental Congress. In 1776, he was made commissioner to Canada to be part of a team to persuade the Canadians to join in the rest of the colonies fighting for independence. Also in 1776, that's where he led four-man committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. So it was largely Ben Franklin who was the architect of the drafting of the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson assisted and is largely given more credit than he deserves, but Benjamin Franklin had the final say in how it would be worded and what would be brought in, including his rejection of Jefferson's preferred use of life, liberty, and property as the basis of law, and Benjamin Franklin chose instead the Leibnizian concept of happiness, not happiness to have cake, but the higher happiness, the higher sentiments expressed by people like Leibniz, Schiller, and others. In 1776, he was also made ambassador to France, where he played a key role organizing French support and broader European support for the American Revolution. He was the organizer of the Treaty of Alliance with France in 1778, the Treaty of Paris, establishing the peace with Great Britain that put a final end to the war between Britain and the USA in 1783, at least in that military expression. As it turned out, Britain never actually forgave America or went away or stopped the war in different means, but the military war was stopped through this treaty. And finally, he led in the drafting of the US Constitution and especially preamble itself in 1787. So a very busy man who didn't waste his time. He also, I would just say this before continuing, was the architect of the industrial, uh, British industrialization through his work in Manchester, where he had organized what's known as the Lunar Society. And these are just several members, including Matthew Boulton, Josiah Wedgwood, James Watt, William Murdoch, and Erasmus Darwin, who were just several leading members of the Lunar Society of Scientists that were looking for useful application of scientific ideas and discoveries in the form of new technologies, and especially with a focus on increasing productivity and internal improvements. And this is what largely drove England's industrialization. It was another American, Ben Franklin, who drove that as well. This is a bit of a point of embarrassment for many British imperial lovers to this very day. To be somewhat sensitive of the terrain that Ben Franklin was living in, looking at the changing contours of the territories of the North American continent, it's useful to just review that it is very different from the sort of configuration of states that we see today. And on the left in 1754, just before the 7 Years' War, we see the land distinct and controlled by the English in certain regions, the French in orange. Most of it, one could say, was the French of North America, and Spain, the Spanish Empire, controlling so much of what is today Mexico, Central America, and even much of the northern Latin America, South America as well. And on the right, after the 7 Years' War was finished, most of the French territories, excluding Haiti, became British controlled or Spanish controlled. We have Russia there on the upper left in Alaska, which is another important part of this broader story, and there are unclaimed disputed lands that were also fought over. By 1774, what we had is again that same disputed land in the left, and the Hudson Bay Company is another area that is very important. A private company that had the majority of Canadian land in today's Canada was a private company, sort of a subsidiary of the British East India Company. And what you have is the Proclamation Line of 1763 defining the New England colonies, those nations or those colonies that would declare independence. In 1774, as I mentioned, we knew that there was a planned Continental Congress where the Declaration of Independence would be signed and ratified soon. But before that Continental Congress meeting that would choose to have a Declaration of Independence, there was a letter that invited the Quebecois to come down and send a delegation saying that we only invite you to consult your own glory and welfare, and not to suffer yourselves to be inveigled or intimidated by infamous ministers so far as to become the instruments of their cruelty and despotism, but to unite with us in one social compact formed on the generous principles of equal liberty and cemented by such an exchange of beneficial and endearing offices as to render it perpetual. In order to complete this highly desirable union, we submit it to your consideration whether it may not be expedient for you to meet together in your several towns and districts and elect deputies, who afterwards meeting in a provincial congress may choose delegates to represent your province in the Continental Congress to be held at Philadelphia on the 10th day of May of 1775. So something very important that was circulated across the Quebecois. The problem was the literacy level was not that high, and very few were actually able among the peasant farming classes to actually read and understand what they were reading. The sympathy and uh, the sympathy for the American cause of revolution was very high amongst the majority of French subjects. However, like I said, cultural levels were much lower, literacy levels were much lower compared to the United States, and the elites of Quebec were much more puppets controlled by Britain, beholden to forces across the ocean, and much more antagonistic to the prospect of becoming a revolutionary participant in this cause. Benjamin Franklin, at a certain point, right before the actual signing of the Declaration itself in 1776, July 4th, before that in the month of April, he was sent down with a few other people to try one last time to organize for a delegation to be represented. And the Continental Congress wrote to Benjamin Franklin, and it said, as instruction, inform them that in our judgment, their interest and ours are inseparably united, that it is impossible that we can be reduced to a servile submission to Great Britain without their sharing in our fate. And on the other hand, if we obtain, as we doubt not we shall, a full establishment of our rights, it depends wholly on their choice, whether they will participate with us in those blessings or still remain subject to every act of tyranny which British ministers shall please to exercise over them. Urge all such arguments as your prudence shall suggest to enforce our opinion concerning the mutual interests of the two countries, and to convince them of the impossibility of the war being concluded to the disadvantage of the colonies, if we wisely and vigorously cooperate with each other. To convince them of the uprightness of our intentions towards them, you are to declare that it is our inclination that the people of Canada may set up such a form of government as will be most likely in their judgment to produce their happiness. And you are in the strongest terms to assure them that it is our earnest desire to adopt them into our union as a sister colony, and to secure the same general system of mild and equal laws for them as for ourselves, with only such local differences as may be agreeable to each colony respectively. So again, a very, very sober, simple idea that would allow a certain degree of flexibility and independence to Quebec as long as they united on principle for the sake of justice together. So keep in mind, one of the trepidations was that French, being Catholic, still abided by civil law, whereas the British practices were of the common law, and there was a certain fear amongst some French that they would have to leave their civil law and adopt common law. These sorts of disputes were inflamed by the enemies of the independence cause, but in reality, there was a complete freedom that was being offered as long as, again, we stood together for principles instead of bickering amongst petty differences that didn't matter so much in the end. So why did Canada fail to accept this challenge? Well, I alluded to two aspects: the corruption of the elite, especially within the Jesuit-managed Catholic system, as well as within the rich seigneury, the feudal system of lords that never wished to give up their controls and were always loyal to the system of hereditary peers located in England. But to give it a bit more detail, we see that there was also the Quebec Act of 1774 passed, which was a British bribe in so many words, to stay small and to think local. As I wrote there, Canada was promised limited representation and local influence over religious practices. So a certain amount of limited freedom would be promised of having a local representative be represented in some form of legislature, which took many years to build, but that would always be under the iron grip of a governor general, of unelected groupings around the governor general that would represent the power of the British crown and its associated institutions that could veto, prevent any legislation from going into law. So again, local controls were promoted at the expense of any top-down considerations or freedom to affect the broader system in which those victims were to be locked up. The other aspect of the Quebec Act I will show you will be an increase of the boundaries of Quebec that were designed to surround the young U.S. states. That was one of what's known as the intolerable acts outlined within the Declaration of Independence. I think 127. Um, Taxation without representation was simply one of those 27. There were many more that were much better reasons to have the revolution and not simply taxation without representation. That is a lie that has been passed down to Americans in their history books so that they do not actually understand what was the nature of the fight that gave rise to their republic. The other that I would say would be very important as well was the threat of excommunication. That is to say that all who fight with Washington will burn in hell for eternity. And this is something that Bishop Briand passed as the head of the clergy of Quebec, passed this edict saying that if, okay, we know that many Quebecois wish to fight with Washington, well, fine, but if they do, they will be excommunicated, meaning they will burn forever. And that dissuaded most of them from fighting. I would say there was a small contingent or two that did go down, and they were very courageous. Especially one was Clément Gosselin, George Washington's French-Canadian spy, as he was called, who did go down and fought boldly and bravely and lived out his days in the United States in Virginia. But so many others remained loyal to the crown. I mentioned the Quebec Act, and one of the things that it did geopolitically is that, as we see on the left in 1763, the actual boundaries of those territories claimed by Britain were of one sort after they were taken from the French. The First Nations had certain rights that were given to them by the British, who would often use certain manipulative practices with the help of Jesuits to induce natives to fight native bands, to create sacred stories from them, utilizing Jesuit myth makers and social engineers, and even to weaponize them to carry out raids against settlers. And similarly, white settlers would be manipulated as well by certain Jesuits operating masked as clergy leaders or other rabble rousers to carry out raids of vengeance against the natives. And this vicious eye for an eye, divide to conquer strategy was successful at keeping the early people at turmoil, especially in bloody war and multi-generational antagonisms between First Nations with each other and with the whites and back and forth. That has been a technique done to keep Christians fighting Muslims, Jews fighting Muslims, Muslims fighting Christians, and Jews, Christian fighting Christian. This is part of the recipe of empire. Keep people thinking about what makes them different from others, how are others different from them, in order to alienate one from the other and thus keep the slaves fighting. Anyway, on the right-hand side is the extended border down through the Allegheny Mountains of the Quebec Act that ensured by the British that the young colony, if it were successful, that it would not be able to spread, but we would be boxed in to the ocean front and not permitted to actually kick out the other hereditary empires that were dominant within the continent. So that came again with certain privileges for those loyal to the crown who remained behind. And Bishop Briand, that's a photograph of him. And this is a letter that he had written expressing his peculiar idea of natural law as something that involves loyalty to hereditary power. And he describes here how the god of the armies, who extends or restricts at his pleasure the boundaries of empires, having by his eternal decrees put us under the domination of his Britannic Majesty, it is our duty, based on natural law, to be interested in all that concerns him. We order you to submit to the king and to all those who share his authority. So he's talking to the Quebec people, his parishioners, and all those living in Quebec, that they are ordered to submit to the king, who is co-equal, the ordained instrument of God, that all we could do was adapt to instead of question, which would be considered an affront to natural law. So this is the figure who threatened hellfire to anybody who chose to fight with Washington. And as I've made a point, although the physical war was ended in 1781 and a treaty of peace was signed in 1783 at Paris, the actual painting that Benjamin Franklin had commissioned to celebrate, to honor that end of the war, was never itself finished because the British delegation chose to not sit for their part of the painting. And it remained unfinished. And there we have Benjamin Franklin, his grandson, John Jay, and other members of the delegation. Benjamin West, the great painter, the president of the British Academy of Fine Arts, was the painter. They chose to keep this unfinished because I think it was a bit of a warning for future generations, as well as a poetic insight into the psychology of the empire that might have signed the words formally of recognition that they had lost the war, but not the truth that the British never forgave America and would always go to work with the help of their fifth columnists inside of the United States to ensure that the US would be undone as soon as possible through intrigue, subterfuge, corruption from within. And here, this particular chapter of the story will round out. But what happened in the ensuing years after 1783, we could see, and by reading some of the chapters in The Clash of the Two Americas, one can read this even in greater detail. But we know that the attempt to replicate the success of the American Revolution in mainland Europe began to falter with the sabotage of the French Revolution. The efforts by Marquis de Lafayette to bring Ben Franklin's principles and strategy to France first, which played a very important role in helping the Americans succeed in their endeavors in 1776. That effort to bring it back to France was sabotaged simply after a few months after the tennis court oath, and increasingly the hopes of seeing a nation liberated of hereditary institutions in France became a Jacobin bloodbath, with British Freemasonic and Swiss Freemasonic operations working together to ensure that all of the great heroes who worked with Ben Franklin surrounding Marquis de Lafayette would have their heads cut off. And so we saw people like Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the great astronomer, scientist, statesman, mayor of Paris, who oversaw the tennis court oath, have his head chopped off in 1792. We saw Lavoisier, the great chemist, who was also an ally of the cause, have his head cut off. The Queen and the King of France, who were lovers of the prospect of, or the best ideals of America, were also murdered, and many others were too. By the end, 40,000 people, many poor people, I would say the majority were even just poor citizens who had their heads cut off. And those like the Jacobins and the Girondins would take turns vying for power with the Jacobins at various times, acting upon the principle of emotional rage, the Rousseauian feeling state of the noble savage that would be the pure unadulterated, uneducated masses that would be rallied for justice to kill the elites, where the revolution would need no scientists, said the banner of the French revolutionaries, killing their scientists, the elites, the elitists. And when that anarchy became unmanageable, we saw a backlash of the Girondins, the logical faction that would worship to the cult of supreme reason. Um, and they would take turns chopping the heads off of the Jacobins, and the Jacobins, using the tool of emotion, would gain power and chop the heads off of Girondins, and back and forth until there was no one left, and only a vacuum remained in which fascist strongmen would be able to fill it in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte. And the age of Napoleonic Wars were to tear Europe apart for over nearly 2 decades. And recall from the last lecture, number 2, when I cited from LaRouche's secrets known only to the inner elites, he made the point that that unbroken line of continuity of ideas and methodology of conspiring, discovering, transforming society for the better in opposition to the Dark Age faction, represented here positively by the Platonic elites, was cut off in Europe, especially through the activities of Jeremy Bentham, those Freemasonic intelligence operatives working to sabotage, and who did such a powerful job at sabotaging the French Revolution that then was sabotaged elsewhere across Europe too. So that faction suffered a major blow, nearly a mortal blow. I think actually they suffered a mortal blow between 1780, 84, 85 is when it really began, and it really peaked at around 1815, 1816, with the Congress of Vienna and the restoration of the monarchies after the Napoleonic War, which is both a purge of Europe's Platonic Christian humanist elite in the science, statecraft, artistic community from universities that were purged, censors, strict controls over ideas, the banning of poems, ideas of Thomas Paine was brought in almost like a new inquisition, and that crushing was fatal. In Canada, a synthetic nation was created, built upon hereditary principles, and was held as a chess piece in the great game. And that British Canadian chess piece, the only only monarchy of the Americas, of all the American nations, only Canada remains a monarchy. And that real estate has been used throughout the ensuing century to keep America unstable, to keep the Arctic undeveloped, to ensure a wedge that would forever prevent the potential development of economic cooperation by the Americans and Russians, who had historically been strong allies since the earliest days of the American Revolution, when Tsarina Catherine the Great and Ekaterina Deshkova, the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences and close friend of Benjamin Franklin, worked to create the League of Armed Neutrality. And that largely also turned the tide in favor of the Americans, who were finally able to be given the support that they needed, and that formed the basis of today's modern maritime law. That League of Armed Neutrality was organized by the Russians, which largely saved America in its early years. And again, in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, when Russia once again came in to save America, partially in reciprocity for America's support of Russia during the Crimean War against British, French, Ottoman intrigue that worked to destroy Russia in 1856. So we have a tendency of collaboration. We saw this peak after the Civil War with the creation of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the collaboration between great Americans and great Russians during the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany and fascism more broadly. And always Canada was used again and again, and we're going to see this in more detail in the coming lectures, to be a zone that would run terrorism against the United States, that would carry out murders of American presidents, especially Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, whose murders were both carried out through British Canadian run operations in Canada, in Montreal specifically, in both cases. And things like the hereditary institutions, the sub junior hereditary blocks like the family compact that was so suppressive and served as an instrument along with United Empire loyalists that were the elites that came to Canada from the United States after the War of Independence, wishing to remain loyal to the system of empire. That became the foundation of the sacred stories, the national myths that were told to Canadians over many generations and that gave an illusion of having independence, but none of the reality, as we saw with the Canadian Constitution earlier, or even every single oath of office taken by every prime minister that must declare fealty to the Privy Council and the oaths of secrecy that would be told in Privy Council to all prime ministers and all cabinet ministers by law. So we have this problem, this deep state structure. It's very much tied to the Wall Street deep state structure that was baked into the United States as certain traders who chose not to leave the colonies after the independence, but remained behind, acting on the surface like patriots, but always endeavoring to undo the precedent of the creation of a republic founded upon a rejection of hereditary principles and the consent of the governed instead. And these were the groups such as Aaron Burr, who created such things as the Bank of Manhattan, who established such institutions as Wall Street per se, and that always worked to, again, infuse the virus of empire and to transform America itself into a junior partner of a British Empire. So that is the source of the stories. We will shed more light on this, and especially leading up to the fight for a Eurasian system of global development that will be taken up in the next lecture. How Russia saved the United States will be also taken up in the next lecture. And the international dynamics of 1776 and 1865 will also be unveiled in some detail. So this was a slightly shorter, but I think still a potent presentation as far as idea content, and I hope to see everyone next class for lecture number 4. Thank you.